Welcome to yet another episode of The Truth in Development, empowered by Ndiso Consulting Group. My guest this evening is none other than Shanaz Treathaway. She is a strategist, she is a CA, she is an all-round business person, but also a lacquer person. And I'm really looking forward to have this conversation with her as we broach the subject of how does South Africa, and indeed Africa, unlock its developmental potential using the instrument of entrepreneurship. So I'm hoping that you stay with us and you become part of this conversation, and indeed all of the questions that you will have, you will then be able to put through so that we can perhaps entertain them together with Shanaz. Shanaz, thank you so much for coming through.
Oh, well,
I appreciate you coming through.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's always wonderful to have a conversation with you and explore this topic. It's a very important one.
So, off air, we were speaking about the idea that conversations around entrepreneurship and development can become very, very nebulous and not directed. You even use the term, sometimes we don't know what we don't know, in order for us to be able to direct the conversation in a meaningful way. I kind of feel like that right now.
Yes.
But I'm guided and inspired by the question that says, unless we are commercially viable, unless we are creating businesses that are creating opportunities and jobs for people, then the levels of development that we might seek for South Africa and the rest of the continent will not be realized. Where do we start the conversation?
So I think firstly, to have this conversation and to be brave about it and to name the things that are potentially elephants in the room in a non-judgmental way as to where we need to start. I think we need to start speaking about the things and the questions we have without people feeling as if they themselves are questioned, their authenticity, their willingness, them doing their best. We need to move our economic agenda forward. And the first thing we need to do is to be honest about where we're at, honest about where we're missing the mark, and honest about what we reasonably can achieve in the near future before we set ourselves these huge aspirations that seem unattainable.
One of the things that I remember that was said by former President Thabo Mbeki was that South Africa is a very strange place, that we live in a country that has two economies. And my understanding of what he was saying was that we have an advanced, almost first world economy. And in the same space, we have a third world developing economy. And I suppose those are the challenges of trying to make some sort of alignment between these two economies. First of all, do you agree with the idea that we have two economies? And is it possible to align these? And is entrepreneurship perhaps one of the instruments for doing so?
Good question. And yes, I agree that we have two economies, if not more, because of our diversity and undeniably our history of where we come from. Can we align it? Well, there's varied opinions about it. From where I come from, I believe what ties people together is something very core to who we are.
Yeah.
We have a resourcefulness and a grit to us. Whether you're resolving a technical issue or not having power at a scale of a listed company, or you're trying to make food without power in order to sell as a street vendor. There are commonalities about having grit and persevering through very real on-the-ground issues that we have. And when we start seeing those commonalities and understanding how we're creating wealth through that, then we'll actually start bringing these closer together. We can start having empathy for all of the different strife and economies and needs people have across all of these different socioeconomic backgrounds.
Is the instrument for wealth creation only limited to entrepreneurship?
Well, entrepreneurship is a very broad term. So I think it's not only, in my mind, when you talk about entrepreneurship, it is a very, very broad. It can be, it's everything that falls into wealth creation over there. Anything that's about innovation and creatively thinking on how you can provide, whether it's a plate of food in front of you for your family or for community. It is that, how do I take something that is a need socially and productize it? How do I take potentially a passion of mine and create it into a commodity? What we now understand is that the next phase of entrepreneurship is potentially where we need to structure it. And that for me is the interesting questions. There's enough creative thinking, but where does it go when we talk about this umbrella of entrepreneurship?
The first economy
Yes.
in South Africa that has been characterized by a major availability of resources
Yeah.
that have created organizations that have become global, that have achieved a level of sophistication that, again, is global. I'm talking about the big companies, the Anglo-Americans, the big companies that anybody can think about that are essentially associated with South Africa. Billiton, and the whole conversation that's taking place now about the possible buying of Anglo-American assets by Billiton. We'll talk about that later. But we've got companies in South Africa that have become global behemoths, right? But they come from a history of what I could perhaps crudely call extractionism. That these were businesses that were not necessarily about the development of South Africa and the African continent. It was fundamentally about extracting certain resources to create wealth for other parts of the world. And then there's the reality of the entrepreneurship that followed that reality, that was about subsistence, that was about trying to make sure that those big organizations are either fed, clothed, and given homes, and secondary industries then developed out of that, and further on it goes. I'm asking this question because I still get the sense that the big organizations and the big companies are still essentially not about the development of South Africa and Africa, that they are still very much about the extraction of those resources. And I'm concerned that perhaps that paradigm needs to shift so that the centricity of their efforts is South Africa and Africa.
So I'm going to make a statement. How do you unscramble an egg? So perhaps it's controversial, what I'm going to say. Rewind those many years ago when someone arrived here and said, with their mindset, I have a right. Today we question those rights. But at that time, that was a very real right that those individuals who landed here said, we're going to create something, whether it's mining, and we're going to take it to the structures, whether it's offshore to our countries that we originally come from, because that's the structure. That is what we're feeding. And those were the structures that determined how what we have today were formed, right? So your question comes back to say, how do we potentially take something that was formed with a certain mindset today, which we have no influence over, and was very real and relevant? How do we redefine that? Now, there are certain...
And redirect it, yeah?
And redirect it,
Yeah.
because they are very real companies. Let's be countries. Let's be honest. If you go to Botswana, they have diamonds. They're diamond rich. they made the decision when forming all of this to go, wait a moment, there are no unrefined diamonds that will leave our country, therefore containing their own economy, right? Limiting anything that goes beyond. So we need to start actually understanding what those relationships are and what is negotiable. Can we go to the people right now that have, as you name, these behemoth conglomerates that are global and say, let's redefine what you did 100 years ago in order for us to redefine our economy? I think that's a very long conversation that may not serve us in our lifetime. So we need to understand what is limiting factors right now for those conglomerates and those big diversified industrials potentially to invest in what we believe are these microeconomies that we have in our country. So what are those limitations, and what in our grit and resilience and creative thinking can we do to bridge that crevice, right?
I get that. And again, I don't want to fall into that syndrome of dependency, where that faculty of grit, resilience, is only going to be dependent on the big behemoths. I really think that it is part of the entrepreneurial culture to exercise and create stuff with what you have.
Yes.
But I suppose the reason why I mentioned the behemoths and their raison d'etre, why they came to these parts to begin with, is because a particular economic structure was created by that reality. And I'm wanting to find out, how do we catalyze, how do we start a situation where businesses that are for South Africa and Africa are developed by South Africans and Africans, without always wanting to be a crutch for something that came before them and not necessarily for South Africa and Africa. I would hasten to say that the big telecommunications companies, the Vodacoms, the MTNs, are a great example of that. That these are companies that came out of the reality of South Africa, the technological advancements that came as a result of that, the innovation by South Africans and Africans that have grown, and they've become real businesses to reckon with, real businesses to reckon with. But I'm wondering whether or not similar things can still come out of the realities of South Africa that are not just technological based, given the fact that the majority of the people in this country still aren't as exposed to those technological advancements as we would like them to be, in order for them to bring about the innovations that can be global at some point in time. I don't know whether I'm limiting my thinking in as far as that is concerned, but I'm thinking that there must be some sort of opportunity out there that can really catapult South Africa's development and the people of this country, without always having to lean on the structures that were created by the behemoths. Does it make sense?
No, completely, because it's the hand that feeds you. And unless you understand how to feed yourself, what happens is you're always going to be looking for that hand. Now, I think entrepreneurship in South Africa definitely has to be a synergistic relationship. I think in a worldwide, because you create something to scale it, you end up having funding, you end up having investment, you end up having all of the various different interested parties and stakeholders that are going to allow you to take it to the next level. So I actually, having heard what you said, am interested to take a step back, because we're talking about two different, in my mind, skill sets, and two very different entities, if I can put it this way, whether it's the human or the organization, and behind every organization there are humans. When you're talking about large corporates, I think we've mentioned it before. We've gotten to a stage where it's wealth management. And I talk about, even in there, you have a certain level of innovation, but it's a predetermined, here, this is what we've got, a pot of people that is going to diversify and create another revenue stream. Here we go, provided you perform all of these check boxes that allow us to understand what you're doing, you will have access to an innovation pot. So it's management. Entrepreneurship in its entirety is all about creation. Creating something, and its end goal, by its nature, has an unquantifiable and uncertainty to it. And that requires a different skill set and a different personality. So now you've got these two almost diametrically opposed concepts, entities, behaviors, skill sets, and you're saying, how do they support each other? And then there's this big gap in between to say, who's going to do the translation? So in our country, I would say we've got a huge crevice. This little crack ended up being big. We have a crevice, and now we're trying to fill it. And it's the hand that you're speaking of. How much are we going to pour into this to fill it so now we're even? And I challenge that. It's not to be filled. It's to find bridges, because that crevice will never be filled. But when we understand, how do entrepreneurs who are should be held accountable, become relatable to the funders and the investors and those that need the checkbox? What language are they speaking? How are they empowered? How can they build a bridge across to make what they're doing versus what they require meet somewhere in the middle? And I think that's, for me, the interesting space. That's the leap we need to start taking to understand what that looks like.
I think that is so fascinating, that crevice perhaps does not need to be filled, that bridges need to be built over that. Great analogy, resonates with me. Give me an example.
But it goes back exactly to what you're saying. If you go to Anglo and you've got someone that has an idea, what happens is that you're talking about the hand, the money. How do we start filling that with money? And so they start putting it in to almost equalize and say, you've got an entity that is valuable, that has all of the structures that we have in this corporate, so we are comparable. But actually what needs to happen is the innovative idea needs to say, I can generate revenue and I can make it understandable to you. And then what happens is it looks different. Does that make sense? Okay, let's think of another example. And this is another controversial one. Farms and land, perhaps reappropriation. Are we ever going to fill the crevice of understanding on how to maximize our agricultural sector? Do we have to redistribute everything and make everyone equal in order to understand that we're back to being equal? Well, actually it's a bottomless pit, because you go, this belongs to this one, but there was someone before you that belonged to, someone before you that belonged to, someone, and that's a never-ending gap until it makes no sense to anyone. No one wins. Whereas if we go, oh, hang on, what if we ignore the depth of that, but understand where we can actually build the bridge? What can I own versus you own? Who can hold who accountable to what? What are the measures of success until you can take over? And suddenly you've got a position of agreement that then you move forward.
I was having a conversation recently with another luminary who was talking about the current political situation and the fact that we are finding ourselves in a situation where political parties must collaborate. They must find some sort of conversation. They've got to do that.
Exactly.
The fact that there has been no outright winner in the last elections has necessitated the fact that there must be some sort of collaboration. There must be a seeking out of partners and partnerships. But I suppose part of the challenge with that reality is that there are feelings of entitlement, there are feelings of competition, there are feelings, and it sounds to me like even in the commercial entrepreneurial space, those similar kinds of dynamics might actually still be there. How do we overcome them?
Sure. You're asking me some really difficult questions.
Because I think, Shanaz,
Yes.
that's our real challenge. I don't believe that we have a shortage of solutions to a problem. I think, though, what we do have is a shortage of the tonality and the right conversations so that those problems or those solutions can then emerge. So it sounds to me like it's a greater, the biggest problem is a communication problem. How do we do that?
I go back to, where do we first have agreement? Before we disagree, we coexisting. Just take you and I. We have different backgrounds, we have different skill sets. We're coming here and we're having a very real conversation. And we can have it without walking away offended, even if we have really different opinions. We can debate it, we can agonize over it, we can try and convince each other. We can walk away next week and can have a fantastic conversation again. At the end of the day, we understand that we agree that asking the questions and being curious about it and exploring the differences in it means we have a better chance of coming out better at the end than just trying to get our way. There's a point of agreement there. And whatever you present, from my perspective, there's no judgment, and similar to you, there's no judgment, because we're both valid from where we come from. And I think that's the first point. Should be a point of agreement. What do we want to achieve out of this? We want to achieve understanding a different perspective. And in that, we're not going to hold judgments against it, because you're doing the best with what you've brought. And I believe that's the space that we need to start creating, and we need to start understanding how well are our people equipped to do that. Because what you're talking about is a people and communication problem. If an entrepreneur goes to procure funding, which is one of the fundamental drivers as to why we perhaps not getting as further as we should, how are they effectively communicating what they want to achieve? And how are they comfortable with understanding that the hand that's providing the funding will need certain measures of accountability?
Assurances, yeah.
Yeah? Because you have achieved so much and come from a certain background doesn't necessarily mean that we can negate those. Similarly, how does the large corporate understand how heavy and regulatory and onerous some of the requirements are and bridge that gap? We both want to succeed. We both understand. Where can we go from there? So it seems idealistic. However, you and I are doing it right now.
And somebody might say, you guys are supposed to be talking about entrepreneurship. You're now talking about communication.
Yes.
And relatability and connection. Is that entrepreneurship?
Yes. That's the core of it, isn't it? You start with a passion. You start with identifying a need, whether you're an individual or group of individuals that are like-minded. It's the fact that you relate to that concept that you want to bring to the community, that you want to commoditize, that you understand has value in the eyes of others. If others don't see that value, you're going nowhere slowly, right? And that's that bottomless pit of money. Just believe me. So relatability is very important on many levels. What you're producing, that it actually is going to relate to others. Relatability as in the stakeholders besides the communities that are buying into it, your funders in the more formal area, understand what you're trying to achieve, and you yourself can achieve a sense of commonality. It's a connection. So that's what I'm defining as relatability. There's a connection.
I listened to various conversations about the economy, about entrepreneurship, about commercial ventures. And somebody will say, no, the first thing we need to do is we need to industrialize. Or somebody will say, no, we need to really focus on the opportunity that's presented by artificial intelligence. And then somebody else will say, no. Where we should actually be focusing on is social entrepreneurship. And I get a sense sometimes that those conversations are simply trying to get to the lowest hanging fruit without having really thought about the layer of the land in the way that we're having the conversation now. You're a strategist. You've got to think about the application of certain modalities and practicalities in a particular business context. Where are the low-hanging fruit for South Africa in as far as the catalyzation of entrepreneurship? Are there specific sectors that you look at and say that's where it's at? Or is it all of the above?
So I think everyone is bringing those to the agenda because it's a reflection of what they see as the social need. As a strategist, I go higher and higher, and I go, entrepreneurship is a reflection of a social need. Creating a product, reflection of a social need. So the lens through which we look through all of this is to say, what do our people need? And if there's a country with such diverse, as you said, economies and people, we have a lot of needs. The access for people to get their needs met is where we as a country obviously are falling short. Where there's access to funding to start getting these distribution channels to the people is where we're potentially falling short. The ability for people to understand how to scale the businesses beyond their localized context is where we're falling short. So I wouldn't say that there's one above the other, because I can go, technology is a revolution. But then in all fairness, I need to understand how many of our people in our country have access to technology platforms besides banking and a mobile phone. So I definitely think from a corporate perspective, there is this growth into using technology in self-serving platforms, self-service. How do individuals own their identity, own their own journeys on digital platforms? That is where those are going. When we're talking about product, I'm talking about bringing in manufactured, very affordable goods. And of course, we live, if I look at almost the low socioeconomic, the entrepreneurship is at a very survival level. How are people's needs being met in terms of sustainable food, education, caretaking, shelter, roofs over their heads, transport? So because of this diversity in our country, there's a lens for each one of them, right?
We're coming to a close. Could it be that part of the challenge is that we don't think hard enough about why we want to be entrepreneurs or in business? In other words, do you think that we do enough thinking about the viability of whatever it is that we want to do beyond just wanting to be survivalists, to just earn some money? Because my sense is that the viability of any business started by an entrepreneur, has got to be unassailably linked to a why.
Yes.
That goes beyond, I want to make money. I want to make money. I want people to make money, right? But the making of the money must be a byproduct of a viable contribution to society.
Yes.
I would argue. Do you think that we spend enough time? Do we have enough time? Do we understand the value of the spending of enough time as to understanding why we want to be in business, why we want to be entrepreneurs?
You hit the nail on the head. It is very much about, earlier on when we said, relatability. Viability and relating, because you believe that product holds value and you have a passion for it. There needs to be very critical thinking and real thinking about how that is more than just you and your immediate surrounding. Because that is not, entrepreneurship at its best is scalable. When I talk about scalability, I'm saying taking that nugget and amplifying it. And in that you have many failures, what works and what doesn't, what people will relate to and what they don't. And every single time this very question of, is it viable? Is it relatable? And it's exactly the financial the finances are the consequence of being critical along that path. Facing when things don't go right and being brave enough to discard it, start again, or build on something that was counterintuitive. And that is not only pervasive to your entrepreneurs, it's pervasive to how you also manage wealth. Interestingly enough, it exists in both of these worlds. If we don't critically analyze and we just merely chase the money, we may actually miss the viable options. We're not holding ourselves accountable to the true measure of creating a successful ecosystem, successful entrepreneurship, successful innovation, successful growth. And I think that's a very, very relevant point.
As we close, you're a business person yourself, you're an entrepreneur yourself, you are a trained chartered accountant, you're a strategist. What ignites the beginning of development on the African continent, in South Africa, in such a way that South Africa and the continent become real, equal players in the global economy?
I'm going to offer a human quality, courage. That's what we need. We need to be brave. We need to own our mistakes. We need to own that there's a crevice. We need to understand what we can achieve and can't achieve. We need to put our pride aside, egos aside, have real conversations and name elephants in the room. Be accountable for what we've put our names to.
Give me one elephant in the room.
Spending money which hasn't rendered returns. Investing in things and initiatives that haven't necessarily scaled and served our people. Believing that potentially us as South Africa lead the continent in economic growth. We've got equals across this continent, and we should address those people as our equals, and build those bridges. And I think we need to be courageous enough to acknowledge where we're falling short, and learn the lessons from some of our counterparts that have managed to translate into the international arena. So I think I would really encourage courage.
And is entrepreneurship the tool that must be wielded by that courage?
The tool, meaning, I would say, conversations, right? Speaking, asking for help, asking for mentorship, trying to gain understanding from what takes you out of your understanding into the other person's understanding and gain that funding. Putting yourself aside. Does that offer you the tools?
Yeah.
A product is about serving something beyond yourself. So sometimes we need to put ourselves aside. Sometimes we need to do things that others need us to do in order to get that step further. And I think we need to start understanding that we may not always have the skill set. How does someone come along and help me do a financial plan? When I get to a certain size, am I brave enough to understand that if I've got a 50 million rand revenue generating SME, I'm not the be all and end all of this company. I now need to step aside and understand how others may be able to scale it. Being a founder doesn't make you a business owner, doesn't make you a business person. It makes you perhaps a successful entrepreneur, right? Because now there's structures in place. So I think we need to get out of our way sometimes.
Shanaz Treadaway, thank you very much for agreeing to talk to me and just the sagacious insights that you've given. Thank you very much.
Oh, such a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. And that brings us to the end of this conversation. Lots to think about. Thank you very much for joining us.